July 28th, 1932. Washington, D.C. is burning. Not that time. Tanks roll down Pennsylvania Avenue, not to fight some foreign invader, but to fight protesting World War I veterans. Hi, I'm Crate13, and due to Microsoft canceling support for Windows 10, I no longer have a working PC to have my logo show up behind me. Today, we're talking about the forgotten rebellion of the Bonus Army. As always, let's go back and get some context. It's 1918, and our boys had just hopped back from across the pond from saving Europe. Depending on who you ask. And yes, before you comment, we were the deciding factor in who won World War I. The French army was on the verge of a mass mutiny, and the news of American forces coming to reinforce them actually helped keep them from full-on rebelling against the French government. And a lot of bankers had invested in the Allies and had a lot of money on them winning, but that's besides the point. The Doughboys had fought hard, and they were coming home. Traditionally, after any war where we had won, our soldiers would get a bonus upon returning home. But it was a little bit different this time. Veterans wouldn't get a bonus approved until 6 years later in 1924, and they wouldn't even be eligible to get it until 1945. Funny foreshadowing there. Now, at the time, the veterans were fine with this arrangement because they would get compounding interest on all of their payments for every single year the payment was delayed. So up to 21 years of compounding interest, which is a pretty good deal. But a little thing happened in 1929. The Great Depression came in, and the money, it went out. And families across the nation were hurting and starving, including those same veterans' families. Now, at this point, many veterans' bonuses would have been worth well over $10,000 in cash, which would have helped save a lot of their families. So naturally, they wanted their bonuses early. A soldier by the name of Walter Waters, try saying that 5 times fast. Got a mask hair in that. Walter Waters began marching towards Washington, D.C., and he quickly began to get a following. Soon he had massed a force of 43,000 demonstrators, 17,000 of which were veterans, all marching towards Washington, D.C. The media would dub them the Bonus Army. They would arrive in Washington, D.C. in May of 1932. They would encamp at Anacostia Park, which was actually against federal law at the time, but the general, who for some reason was in charge of this park, actually gave them permission to stay there. This general's name was Ulysses S. Grant III, the grandson of the famous Civil War general, and grandfather of famous gay vampire fanfiction writer, Ulysses S. Grant VII. It seems in the end, Lee ended up winning. So, the men quickly set up camp, and even more. They brought their families with them, and it started to resemble a small functioning town. The camp, which was named Camp Marks after a nice police chief by the name of Marks, the camp was tightly controlled by the veterans. They went around setting up streets, sanitation stations, they even had their own functioning police force, and they would hold daily parades. A vibrant community arose around several key sections, including a religious section where worshipers could be seen giving gratitude to God and thanks for being better off than others were during the Great Depression. Also popular was the Salvation Army Lending Library Tent, which functioned as a makeshift post office. It was said that postage stamps were actually worth more than cigarettes were in the camp. To live in the camp, members had to prove that they were either veterans in the war by showing they were honorably discharged or provide a bonus certificate. Upon seeing either one of these, men were issued membership cards, which they would carry around with them to prove that they could be in the camp. By all accounts, it was a pretty peaceful and positive protest. But the government didn't want to pay. There were over 3.6 million men eligible for the bonus, and it would cost the government over $3 billion to pay all of them. And that was just money the government didn't have. So, President Herbert Hoover said he wasn't going to pay the veterans. He was not willing to increase taxes on every other American just so they could be paid. Which, how about that? A government that says, hey, we can't afford this, so we're not going to buy it. That is a lost art in today's age. Regardless, a bill was drafted that would pay the veterans, and it did pass the House, but ultimately lost in the Senate on July 17, 1932. After this, Hoover instructed his chief of police to remove the veterans from their encampment. It was at this point, when a group of veterans were told to disperse, they began to riot. And in the chaos, a police officer drew his revolver and shot into the crowd. He struck fatally William Hushka and Eric Carlson. After this, things only escalated. A man by the name of John Pace, who was the head of the Detroit Communist Party, gathered up 200 men and tried to storm the White House to overthrow the government, which obviously that failed, and he was promptly arrested. You see, that's where the real fear of the march actually came from. The FBI came to the conclusion that many communists had actually infiltrated the march and were planning to use it to stage a nationwide uprising in order to overthrow the government and install a communist dictatorship in America. Hoover himself believed this and wrote in his memoirs in 1948 that he personally believed 800 to 900 men were communist agents. This part is really debated because many of the veterans hated communists. Like, communists were banned from the camp. The whole motto of the bonus march was eyes front, not left, to signal to the public that this wasn't some kind of communist left-leaning thing. This was just some guys who wanted to get paid what they were owed. But it was no matter. They had the stink on them. At this point, only 16,000 people were still left in the encampment, but the army was called in to disperse what was left. The president put General Douglas MacArthur in charge of the operation. He ordered him to be hands-on during the entire operation to make sure the situation was monitored correctly, and also to be gentle with the veterans, considering they sacrificed a lot for this country. Keep this in mind. MacArthur chose General George Patton to be his second in command, and a young Dwight D. Eisenhower to be his own personal aide. So, when Hoover said gentle, MacArthur heard scorched earth. He commanded Patton to take 5 M1917 light infantry tanks, the same tanks that the men would have used in Europe, and start marching them towards the camp, along with the 3rd Cavalry and the 17th Infantry Regiments. The public came and lined the streets to see what was going on, and the bonusers, coming out and seeing weapons and vehicles from their war in the street with the public coming out and cheering, thought it was a parade in their honor. So they brought their families out, their kids, their wives. They came out to cheer for them. However, the cheers quickly turned to screams when the federal troops fixed their bayonets, launched tear gas into the crowds, and ordered a full cavalry charge into the crowd. 55 veterans were injured and 135 were arrested. And one wife of a veteran suffered a miscarriage from the assault. The remaining bonusers retreated back to Camp Marks, and President Hoover, being able to hear all of the commotion from the White House, ordered MacArthur to stand down. This order was refused. MacArthur claimed the veterans were mounting an insurrection to overthrow the government. Okay, side note about MacArthur, this dude sucked. Like, he always did shit to like the most extreme way he could do something. Okay, he got fired from being the head UN general during the Korean War because he, in his own words, wanted to turn China and North Korea into a radioactive sea. He asked Harry Truman for 50 nuclear bombs to end the Korean War. He also famously fled the Philippines in 1941 during the Japanese invasion and vowed to return. But to cover his retreat, he ordered 41,000 men to stay behind to cover him. Those 41,000 men would be captured by the Japanese and forced on the Bataan Death March. Many of them suffered some of the worst torture imagined by any American POW, probably ever. Anyways, he ordered the attack to continue. His aide, Dwight Eisenhower, urged him to stop, saying that it was not worth all of the negative public backlash they were going to get, and it just wasn't right. He was saying that we shouldn't be using our own tanks, our own troops, to stomp down veterans of the First World War. It was just a shitty thing to do. Eisenhower recounted himself saying, "I told the dumb son of a bitch not to go in." But his complaints fell on deaf ears. Hoover sent 2 more orders to stand down, and both were ignored, which is funny to me because he claims he's putting down a rebellion by rebelling against the president's direct orders. The Federals marched across the bridge and then set Camp Marks on fire with all of these veterans' property inside. Everything these people owned during the Great Depression, the government just set on fire. Thank goodness they never set anything else on fire ever again. The resulting fallout from the event was a stain on Hoover's presidency that he would never be able to recover from. He would go on to lose the 1932 election to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 472 to 59. And thus, FDR would expand the federal government at an astronomical rate in an attempt to try and end the Great Depression. It didn't end it actually made it way worse. The former bonusers, seeing a very different administration in the office, decided to come and try and ask again. But this time, instead of sending tanks, Roosevelt sent his wife. Yes, famous, not lesbian, Eleanor Roosevelt went down to the new camp and chatted it up with the veterans, talked to them, heard their plight, and promised them new jobs in the Civilian Conservation Corps. But there would be no early payment. Congress eventually passed a bill saying the veterans would get paid. When it got to FDR's desk, he vetoed it. But then, Congress vetoed his veto, which is a pretty rare thing to happen. So, the veterans, they ended up getting paid, and it was all happily ever after. There were no more wars or any more political riots, especially in Washington, D.C., and no fears of insurrection ever happened again. Oh, shit. It was really neat seeing a lot of parallels to like recent history with this video, but also like all the cool little cameos that were in it, because like all of these guys that were involved in like a objectively horrible part of American history all came together and did really good things in the Second World War, in both the European and the Pacific theater. And for all the crap that I gave MacArthur, he was instrumental in beating the Japanese, which again, in my opinion, probably the worst faction in World War II. The things the Japanese were doing were like comic book evil, like supervillain levels of bad. And he helped not only put an end to that, but secured a peaceful transition of power and transitional government with the Japanese that would go on to be one of America's strongest allies. So for that, you gotta give MacArthur some credit. But if you enjoy this video, I got a little spooky one I posted last week. It's all about a little Dybbuk box. I'll link that up here if it actually shows up this time or not. I don't know. I'm still gonna try and link it and we'll see. But other than that, that's all I have for today. So I want to thank you for your time and your attention. And I hope you enjoy whatever food you decide to eat or whatever poop you decided to poop while you watch your video. I'm Cray13, and I hope you have a fantastic day.